All right, well, welcome everybody. I'm Stout, the director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture. And if you haven't interacted with us previously, we're a center on campus here that is intended to promote interdisciplinary research at the intersection of mind, brain, and culture. And a lot of our typical activities in the past have been invited speakers and workshops and that kind of thing. This year, we're trying to increase our profile as a research incubator to promote collaborations and also concrete things like funding. And so we wanted to organize this event to hopefully encourage people to think about going after a NSF Career Award. I assume that if you're here, you're probably more familiar with the program than I am. But just for the record, the Faculty Early Career Development Program is an NSF-wide activity that offers their most prestigious awards in support of early career faculty who have the potential to serve as academic role models in research and education and to lead advances in the mission of their department or organization. Activities pursued by early career faculty should build a firm foundation for a lifetime of leadership in integrating education and research. NSF encourages submission of career proposals from early career faculty at all career eligible organizations, and especially encourages women, members of underrepresented minority groups, and persons with disabilities to apply. In addition to this event, we'd be interested in further supporting any of you who decide to go after a career grant. And so we'll circulate the sign-up sheet for anybody who would like to be contacted about this and has ideas for further kinds of ways that we could support. For instance, if you might find it helpful for us to organize a writing support group or something like that, we'd be interested in hearing from you and might organize a kind of a meetup to discuss possible ways we could help you with the process. Today, we're very lucky to be joined by two Emory faculty members who have actually succeeded in getting these career awards. Joyce Ho is an associate professor in computer science. She previously co-founded a successful healthcare analytics company, Accordion Health, and worked at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Her research focuses on the development of novel data mining and machine learning algorithms to address problems in healthcare. And some recent projects include identifying patient subgroups or phenotypes, integration of new streams of data, fusing different modalities of data, and dealing with conflicting expert annotations. Her career award is entitled Equitas, a comprehensive machine learning framework to decode health disparities. John Lindo is an assistant professor in anthropology and directs the Ancient DNA Laboratory, which specializes in both the molecular and computational aspects of ancient DNA research. His current research focus is on identifying temporally extended sets of molecular traits relevant to changes in human population density, changes in social stratification, the adoption of agriculture, local pathogens, high altitude adaptation, and environmental changes caused by European contact. His career award is entitled Evolutionary and Adaptive Histories of Human Populations, Integration of Ancient DNA Research, and Interactive Education. So I'll turn it over to our panelists if you'd like to say anything by way of introductory remarks, or we can move to questions. So I'll leave that up to you.
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would say about it is that it's very different from a senior award, mainly because the goals of integrating education and the research need to be throughout the proposal, which is something that's very different. Usually, at least in my field, usually that type of education stuff gets like a paragraph in the broader impacts, as opposed to attempting to have it sort of shine in every paragraph of the proposal, the 10-page proposal. So that's the first thing I would say. And the second, that I think in terms of those of you that are interested in potentially applying, is to get a model from a friend or a colleague that you can use yourself of a successful proposal of a career grant that you can use yourself to start up the process. Because again, it's very different than a senior proposal. And I think it takes a little bit of understanding what it is that you're writing before you submit one of those.
Yeah, the other thing I'd add on is if you have a chance, reach out to the NSF directorate that would sit under like where you would submit to. and offer your services as a panelist. So it's really helpful to know so the career is going to get evaluated a little bit differently, but knowing roughly like what are the general things that they're looking for from your community. For us, at least for I forget what IIII stands for, but one of the biggest things that drove it home through one of the small panels I sat on was they really cared about evaluation, and you really needed to put effort as to thinking about, well, how are you going to evaluate your models? And so knowing some of the, what panelists are looking for is sort of helps you in thinking about the career. The other thing I'd highly recommend, although I probably don't follow it as much as I should, is write it early and get feedback from your colleagues about it. And so for the career, actually, John sort of mentioned this, but education is a big bent. My original education looked just like a standard NSF proposal. And I sent it to my mentor within my department, and she's like, the education is really not enough. You should think about something new that would excite the panelists, something that would sort of like make you a little bit different. And so we brainstormed a couple of ideas. And in the end, what we ended up pitching was, so my career is focused on disparities or addressing health disparities. But what we targeted, it was the same framework can also work for education. And so thinking about that as a separate and thinking about how you can integrate, high school, middle school education then was really something that evolved from our conversation of me passing it to her and getting that feedback early on. I don't know about you, if you had similar things. Yeah.
I know I was an idiot. I didn't have anybody help me write the write the proposal, which was really stupid. I learned the hard way. I would definitely suggest having a mentor or a colleague that's actually been successful in some way with the NSF test to read and give you comments. That's the smart way to go.
Yeah. And like there are people around who have done a lot of NSF, I'd say panelists, I think throughout the Emory community. It doesn't necessarily have to be from your directorate. I think it can be like a side directorate, and they would still have very similar things of what they would look at in the one pager. There's tricks like maybe you sneak the timeline into a different page or how you get around. Because what's going to happen is the 10 page is going to go pretty fast and you're going to have to shrink stuff out. And so some stuff you can put different places, I feel. And knowing what panelists will read and what they won't helps quite a bit. Yeah.
I could start with one, Joyce. You just mentioned volunteering to serve on a panel, which is something that in all my career never occurred to me. You just send an email and say, "Hey, I'm available."
So typically, at least for CS, we usually have a CRA workshop, so Computing Resource Association for New Faculty. They usually invite an NSF program director there, or actually a couple, and then you get their cards. And then mine actually said, go ahead and send me an email. We're always looking for panelists. And so, look through the directorate. There's typically for the calls, you can tell who the main one is. And so send it to them. You won't get routed on the career. So one of the greatest thing about the career, it has one of the higher funding rates, at least in our directorate. It's like 2x better than the smalls. You're also guaranteed very, very good feedback. And so like the career panelists are going to be very curated. They either have to have gotten like a significant amount of NSF grants already, or they themselves have won an NSF career. That's the only way they get on the panel. And I know this because I served on the CRE panel like prior. And so what they do is they really push you to write very, very good feedback for, so if you get rejected or you don't get funded, the goal is to encourage you so the next round you get a little bit further and you get, 3 tries at this. From what I've heard from others, like by the time you get to the 3rd, you're really competitive and very likely to get funded, if you haven't gotten funded already, because all the feedback is very helpful, right? Like, it's fairly static, I want to say, in terms of what the panelists are looking for.
It sounds like that persistence was really important. You submit something, you say get rejected. What would you say is the typical experience of people who have gotten this? Did they have to submit it 2 times, 3 times before they get it? Or any advice or thoughts on it? How many times they have to go through?
It's hard to say. So So I recently got promoted. And so last year was sort of my last year to submit, or last cycle. So 2 Julys ago, I want to say. And so I couldn't submit before because I had NIH Career Award. And that was sort of like keeping my effort. If I did it, I would get in a lot of trouble with my chair. And so last year was really the first year, or the only time I could submit without getting in a lot of trouble. And so I submitted it, and I luckily got funded on the first round. But I have heard stories from other colleagues at other universities where they were on their last try. And all the feedback they've gotten throughout was, every step they got closer, right? So like every round that they got closer. So I don't think that there is like one, like, I think it sort of varies. Every director will also have different value, acceptance rates. So I know for size, which is the computer version, the computer side of the house, it's roughly 10%, or I want to say a little bit higher. They aim for a little bit higher. Smalls are at 4 or 3% acceptance. And so it's substantially better to go after a career in terms of success. It's 5 years, you have more flexibility. You get to spend a lot of time thinking about the education event. And that's really, I'd say, what separates the career from the others. I also want to say with the career, because it's a 5-year horizon, you can think really, really long term, right? Like 5 years from now, what do I want to think about doing? And be a little bit more ambitious, right? And you won't get sort of dinged for being ambitious, right? Like you really want to convince them this is, what will be my name, I want to say in 5 years. Yeah. I don't know if you felt like you were going for something crazier with a career, but
yeah, well, it took me, I got it on the second try, and the first one was actually feasibility for me. They thought that it was too much that could be accomplished by one PI in 5 years. So but also I could have been going crazy. I don't remember. Maybe I was going nuts. But so I guess that it varies. But I will say that I think, well, in my field, biological anthropology is it's really hard to get it. It's rare to get it from. I think I only know one other person that has gotten it in the last 10 years. So it's, but also biological anthropology doesn't have any funding. And I'm sure computer science has way more funding.
Well, yeah, I don't know. Like so careers for computer science has the highest acceptance rate. Beyond that, like it's worse than an IH, I want to say. And certain, like within the directorate, there was like different parts of it. And what as a panelist I've been told is that the CS people like to eat their young, right? And so like, we're if you look at the panel review summaries, like oftentimes what ends up happening is the program director is telling us, you got to rate something higher. Like this, you're basically telling us none of this is fundable of the 20 proposals we've gone through. And so that, I guess we're harsh critics, right? The career is like one of the more friendlier, like accessible ones. I think for like a lot of the STEM related, like bio, I've heard very similar stories as well, like chemistry, physics, from other people that I've talked to, is the career tends to be like the more accessible one, but yeah, clearly anthropology is quite different. So,
yeah, we're probably the least funded, I would think, of all the subdisciplines, well, except archaeology.
Yeah. I was going to say, I'm an archaeologist. I think that should be, but yeah. Are there other questions or?
I was going to ask a kind of related one about sort of more of the formative stages of getting your program together and figuring out what you wanted to put into your proposal versus what you would have put into some collaboration with a colleague. I mean, since this is a single PI deal, how did the concept of it differ and how did you put it together?
So just because you're the sole PI doesn't mean it can't be collaborative. And in fact, I think I had letters of collaboration from 3 other public health and clinical folks. I think what you pitch can be in the context of a broader interdisciplinary project, but what you pitch is things that you would be responsible for doing. And that's how you can think of framing it. So like, I think one of the biggest benefits of interdisciplinary research is the broader impacts is a clear win, right? Like writing that section should be fairly natural because what you're going to tie in is not only contributions to your community, but also the other communities that you're now interfacing with. the harder part to convey across, because the letter collaborations can only say I'm willing to collaborate, is like highlighting how these collaborators will help you, but not spend too much space on it either, right? So like it's sort of this interesting game. But the proposal, what you take out is basically parts that you would do anyways, and that you are interested in pursuing. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I had the same experience. Mine is very collaborative, but I lead the ideas, and it's also collaborative in the educational part because I actually work with Indigenous researchers in the Americas. So one of the things is to actually bring them to Emory, or well, ended up being like Zoom because of COVID, to actually sort of train them in computational biology. And that's collaborative, but at the same time, I'm leading the project and sort of leading the direction. But yeah, there's a lot of letters that went into that in terms of collaborations.
And the other thing I think with the, thinking about collaborations is it doesn't have to be just the research side of the house that you're thinking about collaborations for. I would also advocate thinking about how you might bring in letters of like collaboration related to the education piece as well. And I think that really strengthens the, sort of the interlacing between education and research together. So as an example, I got one from Eric Weeks. I was going to leverage, I think one of the seminar series, I forget, the academic learning communities as an example of something that I wanted to do. And I pitched it to Eric, and he wrote that he would be willing to write the letter, right? But he's not like, necessarily saying CFD will agree to it, but like, having that is also another option. It just strengthens the portfolio. Yeah.
So you emphasize the education part, and can you talk us through a little bit how you thought through what to propose for the education components? Like how innovative do you have to be, and like age range of the education or outreach that you're targeting?
Yeah, so I mean, mine was all about engaging Indigenous researchers. And so most of the researchers that I work with are archaeologists, but they're curious about how to perform ancient DNA and then how to analyze the DNA itself. So that's where my integration in all of those proposed research areas throughout the Americas was to bring in some capacity, those researchers so that they actually learn as we go along through the process and through the analysis, so that they're not just an author in the middle of the paper, but are a senior author or potentially a first author on the papers, instead of just me taking control of everything while they just hand over samples.
So in the proposal, did you need to already have identified people, or this was, here's my idea, I'm going to spend my 5 years like developing this, or?
I did. Yeah. So I had like 10 collaborative letters from researchers that I was going to engage.
Yeah, you sort of have to have an idea of where you're going to go, but you don't necessarily have to identify exactly how you're going to do it. You just have to convince the panelists that you have the capability to follow through on what you're doing. It's sort of like the best way to think about it, right? So it doesn't have to be like set in stone. And I think this is for me, this is one of the big nice things about NSF versus NIH. NSF, I can dream a little bit bigger. Maybe not too big, but like it's sort of, I can be a little bit more ambitious. I don't necessarily have to lay out everything in like some very strict format that I'm going to follow through in the next 5 years timeline, right? But what the panelists want to know is what you're proposing, can you actually deliver, right, at the end of the 5 years? And so you need to make sure that there's some mechanism to convince them that you can do it, but you don't necessarily have to write it all out in stone. Yeah.
And especially as someone who's maybe served on a panel, do you feel that having gotten previous or other NSF funding helps you to get a career grant or like favorable for this particular?
In general, for the career, no. So I can say for the computing side, right, there's really been a push to make early faculty do it earlier. So what they had noticed in the last couple, like I want to say 3 or 4 years ago, was that the faculty that were getting awarded the career tended to be later in their path, like about to transition and be promoted. And that's really not what NSF wanted. They really wanted to encourage, support. I mean, it's meant to be early faculty, and this sort of defeats the purpose. And so I think there's been a consistent push, at least in the computing side, to really start to reward the, early, like first couple of year faculty. And there is a section that, when you fill it out that says like whether or not you've had prior support, but a lot of the ones you'll read will say something like no prior support. And panelists won't bat an eye for the career, at least in our division, they won't. I did find it helpful that I had written one before and I got an award previously, just because there's a lot of the ancillary stuff that takes you much longer. So the non-research side of the house, like where you have to put up other support, like facilities, like all the other stuff that you have to put together, having that set aside made the grant writing process much simpler. I suspect that could be one of the things that could be streamlined. I suspect through the center is like having, this coherent document of what our computing resources, what's, Emory faculty, what are the stats and those things, and that can all hold that. Yeah.
Sorry. When you say time consuming, like, what do you mean? How long did it take you to figure out how and where?
So if you have people in your department who have written it, feel free to ask them, and then you can just tailor it and update it. So once you do it once, like doing it again won't be much, right? But like identifying what resources that you want to leverage and talk about in those sections actually, may take a little bit of time. So I think my original one probably took about 5-6 hours, I want to say, to get all of that stuff, lined up, like dealing with the, knowing to ask the RAS and then doing the budgeting, like that just takes a little bit of back and forth. Once you have a template for that and how you write the budget justification, everything flows really, really quickly. And you can spend a lot more time on the research and education part rather than I want to call it the other stuff, right? But like the other stuff is also read by panelists. So
was that when you're talking about the other stuff distinctive in any way to career, or are you just talking about the kinds of resources and budgeting that you do for any grant?
It's the kinds of stuff that you've done for any other grant. But like if you haven't written a grant before, then
right,
the startup cost of that is unanticipated, right? Because you would think that you only have to do the research part, but that's not the case.
No, for sure.
Yeah.
And that sort of means I feel like I have this intuition that a lot of people may be more familiar with putting together a research grant than they would be with the educational portion of the career. And so I want to talk, a little bit about, how do you, so you mentioned, for instance, assessment of outcomes. Is it required for you to have some sort of assessment of educational outcomes in your grant? We put together a training grant that wasn't funded, but one of the big things we actually had to contract out to have an outside assessor come in. How do you describe what outcomes you're looking for in education, how you're going to decide if you were successful? Are these things that, it's different from putting together a research grant, right?
Well, so if you put together an NSF grant, typically I want to call it, I don't want to say it's formulaic, but essentially what we've been doing is we dedicate about a page or a page and a half of whatever I forget if it's, I always get it confused. Is it 10, 15?
15 with graphs.
So it's, I think it's about 15 pages, right? But essentially, at least 1 to 2 pages is dedicated towards broader impacts. This would be the case for any small, medium, or large. And some of them actually have some broadening participation or education stuff on the side as well. But for the career, you essentially really want to integrate it throughout. And so I would say in the end, probably like 4 or 5 pages are actually sort of dedicated towards education. Now, that could mean like how you might evaluate your outcomes at education, how you're going to tie it into each of your aims over the couple of years. I think it's just like, as John said, you sprinkle it throughout, and in the end, it's a substantial portion. What panelists tend to look at is something new, right? Like, so in other words, I'm not looking for you to do it in a course. Like, don't pitch a course about your project. Like, really, how are you how does this integrate really well with your research, and like is a special thing that only your particular research plan would make sense, right? Or something along those lines.
What are some examples of how it gets assessed, or that how you write about it being assessed? For example, do you emphasize how many people you can reach, or survey results, or what are the sorts of ways that people can think about assessing the education?
I think part of it is laying forth what your goal of the education is, right? So for me, it was maybe making people aware of disparities, or how disparities might, come in through data, right? And so how do you convey that? What are the mechanisms for which what platforms do I have to sort of convey that message, right? Beyond maybe public speaking or something like that. Like, how do I think about targeting not necessarily college kids, but like, earlier in the pipeline, or, there's a lot of discussion about how STEM, certain communities really don't get much STEM access. How might you reach them, right? And so those would be things that you can think about talking about, and have some quantifiable metrics, or some way to say, this is what I'm looking to achieve. This is my reach, right?
Yeah, I also culminated after the 5 years that I would actually create a type of website that's sort of geared off 23andMe, but is more about buy-in from indigenous communities, so that people can understand their own indigeneity if they have it. If it's coming up like on 23andMe and you get that you have indigenous ancestry from North and South America, my goal was to actually help you understand what that actually meant, and that would be accessible to the public.
There's a lot of resources at Emory, I would say, for thinking about education. And so I would lean heavily into them. If as an example, there's like the science festival, right? You can reach, I don't know if you've seen like March, right? Like these kids running around. There's fun things like that's an option. There's the learning communities. There's Sidecar, right? There's all these. I think if you look around, there's a lot of things that you can leverage, that you can speak to, that would help.
To CMBC too, actually. We sponsor courses, but anyway, yeah.
Yeah, right. So I mean, there's a lot of things I think that you could think about partnering with.
So if I could maybe interpret sort of what you're saying is, I haven't heard you say exactly what the educational component is, except that it's focused on sort of learning disparities potentially, right? And that it's an educational component. But how you actually reach people could be through a multiple different numbers of routes that don't have to fully be specified, but are available to you, and here's some examples. Whereas you had more like, here's something concrete that I'm going to try to deliver at the end of 5 years. And so there's kind of a spectrum of what could work.
So one of the things that I pitched in mine, so like I've written a bunch of other proposals since, so I can't exactly remember what I've written. By the time it's funded, you sort of forget what happens. I want to say, but I was working with public health and clinicians, right? And so part of that is to train up like trainees in there, so that we could like bridge the gap, right? And that was one area that I was really excited about teaching, some summer courses where we would exchange minds and run workshops and things like that, or unconference style where people get together. And those would be examples of things that you can sort of pitch that would potentially make sense.
There's something like a website obviously is not free. Other things like, collaborating with centers at Emory might not cost. Do you think there's any sense that like, when people look at the budget, they want to see that you're really serious about the education, that like actually a substantial portion of their money is devoted toward it? Or is it enough to be kind of like, I can do these things as an outgrowth of the research and they don't require their own? I mean, I don't know. Do you have any feeling about whether they'd like to see some money actually plunked on? Maybe you all don't know, but.
If you're going to pitch something that is expensive, there will be questions as to why it's not in the budget. Like that is seemingly expensive, right? If you're gonna pitch stuff that would be natural extensions, like I'm going to leverage these particular capabilities. I think one of, I was discussing holding conferences, like Emory has some conference fund, right? And I said, I would try to get it subsidized through that, right? So identifying like concrete mechanisms to pay for it would also help sort of defray some of the cost, and you can also like request some of it. The career is, well, I don't know about you, but like the career is not much, right? Because it's 5 years, 500K, I want to say. It goes pretty fast. And so I think there's a juggling between how you spend it, but I maxed out pretty quickly. Yeah.
I definitely had a budget for the website. So what I did was I also actually put in a whole scheme as to how the website was going to work, and also identified like Amazon Web Services that would host it, and funding for 2 years to keep it running, and then hopefully have another funding mechanism after that once it gets traction. And then I got assessment from that, which would be depending on how well it's received, and then learning from those 2 years, then hopefully apply it to another NSF to continue if it's successful, that type of thing.
For CS, if you budget Amazon services, you'll get shut down. Yeah, those things they expect that you'll cover somehow. But so like that's why I'm saying, like, if you serve on the panel, you sort of get to know what budgets you're like, what costs you're allowed to do and what you're not. I was told clearly 3 years ago that if you do any computing, that's gonna get slashed. Yeah.
Is that because the resources are there, should be there at the institution for
That's
you?
correct.
Oh, okay. We don't have it.
Yeah. So the resources should be there, or there's like other mechanisms to fund it from the CS perspective. And so like you shouldn't be spending money on that. Like you might not be doing a lot, but there would be some frowns, I'd say, from the panelists. And so yeah.
So if let's say you submit for the first time and yours gets rejected because you put like computing funding in it, would the feedback be that specific that like take this out and explain blah 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 for your resubmission? Like will they give that feedback to you from panel?
Not necessarily in the panel summary, but you will get it in some so NSF typically what happens is there's at least 3 or 4 reviewers who will read your proposal. And then what's going to happen is they're going to get together in a room and discuss all the proposals. So for career, they're required to read every proposal and discuss it. The other ones, like some of them just don't get discussed, right? And that's how they make the panels that go a bit faster. Careers tend to be not that way. But what you'll see is, you'll get a panel summary, and the panel summary is the best one to go off of, because that's, the person who's writing that is specifically dedicated to your proposal and really has to listen to all the discussion and capture the overall sentiment. The panel summary also has to get approved by the program director that is serving on the panel. So they really take a lot of care in crafting the panel summary. Like wording choice matters quite substantially when during this process. And so like I would read the panel summary very carefully. Some of it will point to specific panelist comments, and that will give you an idea. But like panel summary is the first thing I would look at and say, okay, this is what I'm going to look at. These are the sort of the big ticket items you should address. The other ones, depending on how you feel, I would take it or leave it, right? Like ones around budget, I would typically try to resolve just because like it would, they're minor enough that you can make them happy. Yeah.
If you rewind back to the time when, just before you submit this, when you had the idea for the project, is there anything that you thought that said, yeah, this is something that's better suited for career versus a regular NSF grant?
If the education part comes naturally, I would target the career. If you can justify the 5 years, I would target the career. To be honest, actually, I wrote the career because it was my last chance. I wrote it, if it didn't get funded, my backstop was going to be Smart Connected Health. And so I wrote it with that in mind. And I think that I didn't want to restart a new proposal, essentially. So I wanted some mechanism to know that I would have some other place to do it. And that's why I chose the topic that I did. The education thing obviously came later, right, for me, but that's what I did. I'm also not the best role model because I think I started like 3 weeks before it was due. And so like
Can we,
Really
can we
works
delete
well.
that part from?
yeah. Like I mean, like if I had a chance, I would start early. I think as years have gone by, I procrastinate more and more, and so I think I've gotten to the point where I can probably write a grant in a week and submit it out. It may or may not get funded, but like also not the best idea because you really want to vet it, right? Like career happened, I wrote a little bit faster, and so I managed to get a feedback and enough to redo the education piece and rework it. I would not suggest that model. I would really go earlier if I were you, but like again, unless it's on fire in my world, like I don't work on it. So yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, for the career, it was, I think I was just thinking about it in a way of proposing something that I probably work on for the rest of my career. That's the way, and I think like for an NSF senior, they're much like I had won a senior proposal before, and that one was much more targeted towards like sort of something that I don't necessarily see myself doing for the rest of my career. That's the way I was thinking about it.
Right. So if you're trying to decide, like you have a sense in in anthro or maybe even in bio when it makes sense to go after the career versus going after a more conventional research grant. I mean, Joyce said it's not a huge amount of money compared to like other things. And so what is it? Just this idea that it really is a career objective of yours, or is it that you already knew you really wanted to do education? So when does it make sense to target the career in your estimation?
I think it's always wise to target a career.
In your case,
Yeah,
because the
regardless.
approval rate, or
I think there's like a lot of freedom in what you can write compared to all the other grants. For me, the career feels less formulaic, right? And so there's things that you want to, like, in NSF, it's really rare to get something that's 5 years horizon, right? And so like that really gives you a lot of freedom to play with what you want to consider. And so I think if you are eligible, you should absolutely spend the time to write it. I would advocate you do it as soon as you can, just because there's 3 chances. And every chance you are going to get better, right? Because the feedback is, NSF really takes a lot of care in how they evaluate career proposals. It's the one place that I would say, like early career, it's really beneficial, because if you get the reviews for the other ones, like they'll be pretty crappy. Having served on the panel, I know that for a fact, right? Like seeing the difference between a CRE and a small, right? Like funding is roughly the same. Funding rate is much better for the early career, but like the amount of time we spent per proposal, per discussion, per writing the panel summary was substantially higher, right? And the goal is to give you good feedback. And so I think if you are even at all considering an NSF grant, right, like you should always go down the career regardless, right? Like as long as you have the opportunity to go after it, you should do it. This is my advice. Yeah, I would do it earlier too. I would not wait until you only have 1 shot left and you're about to expire. Yeah. Yeah, like your eligibility will expire. Like do not wait for that. Yeah, I think I did everything wrong, right? But it still worked out well. Yeah, but like no.
But I mean, how much did you benefit from the NIH?
I benefited
in terms of preparing for the career. Like,
no, because like that, like NIH and NSF are just so different. Like the writing style is so different. For me, writing an NSF grant is a lot of fun, right? Like, I don't think anybody else would say this, right? I think for me, it's a lot of fun because I can think outside of my box, right? Like, I'm not following any formula. What you'll see is like all the grants that get pitched to career, they're like all very exciting. Like, it's something the PI is always very passionate about, right? Like, and it's like their long-term vision of 5 years down the road what will be, right? Like, what sort of research, what sort of educational goals you want to do. Sorry, I'm like overtaking this discussion. So
No, I agree with everything you're saying. So.
Yeah, I like NSF career is a lot of fun. Like NSF proposals in general are fun for me to write. The career was like easy to write because like I sort of knew what I wanted to do. I was pitching something a little bit more ambitious than what I would normally pitch because I had the 5-year horizon. And so, yeah, I think, yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about that in terms of figuring out what you wanted to do for 5 years and like strategies you used to identify opportunities or how you pulled the various ideas you had had up to that point together? Like what, you know, obviously you work on other projects with shorter term horizons. Like, how did you decide on like this is what I would work on?
So the question is essentially, how did we decide on the 5-year plan, right?
Mhm.
You,
I mean, for me, it was about putting all these little projects together to have a grand vision and where that could actually go in terms of a broader impact, in terms of how I could communicate all of this after 5 years to people who care about it, who aren't in academia, like who are interested about their ancestry and know anything about it because of something like European colonization. So that was there's where my brain was going in terms of putting it all together and have like some grand impact, hopefully.
Mine is more like recency dominated. And so what I pitched was some new collaboration that I had just started up. We had this idea. We in fact went after this Johnson & Johnson quickfire challenge with a collaborator at Public Health. We sort of scoped it out and were very ambiguous, but I was pretty excited about the idea. And so then I took the ball rolling with that and essentially like sketched out what that would really mean from a scarce perspective. Like, you know, what would it take to achieve this grand vision of integrating in new data streams for public health and clinicians, right? So thinking about if I wanted to bring in Twitter data and make it accessible, or if I wanted them to use this in their analysis, like what would that really take? What would it really take to think about it, you know, more nationally? And then pretty soon, like I got to the 5 years, right? Because like I took this project that I was super excited about, really had no idea what I was thinking. Like when we wrote the original, you know, pitch to Johnson & Johnson, we had no idea what we were doing. The career also sort of flushed that out a little bit more for us. Yeah, that's, but like, again, I procrastinated. So like, I would say not a great role model, maybe necessarily to follow, but I just took something that like was really, so like, you know, you're going to spend some time writing on it, pick something that you're the most excited about in that time.
But it sounds like for both of you, you were going to do the work no matter what.
That's correct.
Well, I don't know if I could do it because I would need funding for it. So if I didn't have any funding, I wouldn't be able to do it. But yeah, I would continue to pursue it in some way.
So on a 5-year timeline, then like what's the last year look like? I mean, I'm used to, you know, writing things, you get a couple years, you know, it's the data collection phase and then, you know, a little time for write up and like that, you know, but in this bigger, it's like, is there an expectation that you'll be kind of wrapping things up or it'll still be like pushing up into the last date, you know, and is there a sense on what kind of, is there a progression of activities across the 5 years?
I hope so. Yeah, I think COVID definitely pushed me back, but I guess it pushed a lot of people back. But the idea is that to continue trying to get all of these pieces of the puzzle together to try to get to that culmination point of forming that website. And I do think it's going to take longer than 5 years though. So I don't know what that 5th year is going to look like, but you get that 1 year no cost extension. So of course I'm going to take that.
Oh yeah, you don't say you're planning on it, but,
Yeah.
but you did propose a specific timeline in the grant, right? You're like X, Y, Z, you know, and then you blow past it, but you know, like, but in the last year, is it like, oh, I'll be doing dissemination and so forth activities, or I'll still be collecting data, or like that? I don't know. Maybe the question doesn't make that much sense, but I have a sort of a template in my mind about a research grant, you know, that should proceed through these phases, but.
Yeah, I mean, the last phase was supposed to, for me, that 5th year is supposed to try to actually get this information out to the public in some meaningful way.
For me, the 5th year is like what I think was the most risky research that I could envision. things that I felt may not happen, but like there's some potential that eventually we'll get there. I actually integrated education and sort of like dissemination throughout, and so it was. I think like mine probably started in year 3. All the education like heavy stuff was starting to creep in. I think around year 3. But again, I actually don't remember my grant much, so yeah.
So because the timeline's a little bit longer and you can, dream a little bit bigger than a regular grant, for instance, and you're beginning your career, what is the expectation for having preliminary data available, and is it different than a regular grant?
So I'm going to speak a bit from a panelist perspective, right? You don't necessarily have to have preliminary data, right? Because clearly in some fields that will take some time to do. What I want to be convinced is that you can pull it off. That your previous history would lead me to believe that these are things that you can reasonably hit the mark on, right? Even if you don't have preliminary data, it's not a red flag for me, so long as you have the track record of having done research in this area and like reasonably being able to achieve the first 2 years. Years 3 to 5, right? Like it's research, right? Like things will be a bit crazy, and what you end up pitching may not be what you do, but I want to know that you've sort of thought it through, and that would be the way that I would assess a 5-year grant. Yeah.
But yeah, for our field, or at least the one I wrote, it was important that not only to have the collaborators on board, but also to have the samples and potential permits, that there's not going to be some sort of block to actually getting those samples that the projects are based on. So that was critical, at least for my particular proposal.
Well, have we done it?
Thank you very much. We very much appreciate you spending the time. We got it recorded, so we'll make it available as a resource in general. You can look at it first.
Oh no, I don't watch any video that I ever record. Yeah. It's a one way.
I would never get in front of people.